to kick off this series, maybe I could ask you for some help. If I put up this picture, I found this graphic that is a relational spectrum. How many of you can find a word somewhere on there that applies to your relational status in life as it is at the moment? I'm hoping that just about covers all of the bases. If there's anybody who's outside of that, maybe you could chat to me afterwards and we can add your status in there. Earlier on in the year, I really felt stirred, hopefully guided by the Holy Spirit, to speak around the subject of relationships, commenting on dating, etc., etc. With a church like this, there's a broad spectrum of where we all fit. So I'm not starting this series pretending that we'll cover everything where everybody's at and tick all the boxes of every relational issue that anybody faces. We're not attempting to do that. But what we are attempting to do is to look at the idea of love, romance, and relationships, because they are beautiful and complicated and messy and challenging. This very muted yes to any of that. Particularly because it finished on challenging, and if you're sitting next to your spouse and you were to say yes too loudly, that might also not go well for you when you get home. From the United States, we get this statistic that 50% of everybody who starts a marriage relationship ends it in divorce. 50. In fact, in the last couple of years, that percentage has reduced a little bit. Most of the people who study those kinds of stats reckon that a huge part of that reason is because couples are no longer getting married. We're not speaking, I'm not commenting at all on anybody who's been divorced, but I'm pretty sure that anybody who has grown up in a divorced home, or you've been through a divorce, you wouldn't wish that kind of pain on anybody else. You didn't get married thinking this is the plan for that relationship. So we've got a generation growing up, many of whom are disillusioned with the idea of marriage, disillusioned with the idea of love, disillusioned with the idea of romance in terms of how we've had it before. And yet when we come to the Bible, we see that God is the inventor of all of those things. Marriage is an institution designed by Him. So hopefully in the series on relationship, it's got something for everybody. And I'm presuming that even if you feel called by God to have the gift of celibacy, that's of you never ever getting married, by a calling from God, I'm sure that if you're a Christ follower, you want relationships in this local church and outside to work in a Christ-like way. It's a big deal. Because apart from our own weaknesses and frailties, our own mindsets that we bring into any relationship, is the Bible also teaches that there is a real devil who is out to destroy. And I reckon that one of the areas that he would most like to destroy is families, marriages, relationships, to pervert, if he can't destroy, at least pervert people's idea of what relationships should look like, pervert people's ideas of what sexuality should look like, etc., etc. So we've structured this series around 4 vows. This morning we'll be dealing with the vow of priority, the vow of perseverance next week, in 3 weeks' time the vow of purity, and after that the vow of partnership. And I'd like to just credit a church in the US, Life Church, for giving us some of the ideas that we're borrowing, but hopefully it's very much ours. And each week, we're going to invite you, regardless of your relational status, wherever you fit on that relational spectrum, to make a vow or fashion the vows that we're talking about because they're a vow between you as an individual and God. There's a myth that our culture has propagated. Hollywood carries it on, and Disney is actually probably a perfect place to see this myth stated from very early on, from the youngest possible age. So if you guys don't mind putting up that picture of Sleeping Beauty and Prince Charming. And this is how the idea goes. That in order to be really happy in life, to be really, really, really fulfilled, to live a life that has meaning, you have to meet the one. That one perfect person that gives you goosebumps, that when the smell of their deodorant or perfume brushes across your nostrils, the hair on the back of your neck stands up. When you meet, and if you meet the one, suddenly all the songs on the radio make sense. Suddenly life is worth living. The one is that person who will fulfill you, complete you, make you whole, become your soulmate, which is a phrase not found anywhere in the Bible, if you meet the one. You familiar with it? Yeah, good luck. Now, there's two problems really with this idea, with this, if I could call it a myth, is that it implies that until you find the one, you'll never be fulfilled. Basically, that you're only half a person, if I boil it down into its most unsubtle form, this myth. When I was single and loving it, to borrow off that relational spectrum, I was content, fulfilled. Very well-meaning lady, member of staff at our previous church, engaged me, was asking me about, I guess, my plans regarding romance, and said, well, maybe you'll meet soon your other half. She was really well-meaning. She was pretty caring with her questions, but that phrase was one that troubled me as I left the discussion and I drove away later that day. So basically, what you have implied is that because I'm not married, I'm only a half, and until I meet the one, I live the rest of my life as a half a person, which is terrible. I was really upset by that comment, but not by her, just by the comment, by the implication, let me put it that way. Interestingly, a good chunk of the New Testament was written by a guy named Paul, who never married, and some of the best advice on relationships and singleness came from this man, and he was most definitely not half a person. That's problem one with this myth. Problem two is that none of us were designed to have another human being as our one, as the one, but only ever at best as the two. To have somebody else as the one, to have this idea that one day I'll find the one, and then when I meet the one, and suddenly all the songs on the radio make sense, is to put that person in a position they were never designed to be in. No other human being was designed to complete the other half of my unhappiness or my unfulfillment or my unsatisfaction. No other human being was designed to be the one at very best. They were designed to be the two. And so we could maybe say it like this. We understand this from the Bible, and I'll read a verse about it in a minute. But if you are married here today, this should be our biblical Christian mind, worldview, is that God himself was meant to be and is meant to be my one. And my spouse, if you're married here today, is my two. God is my one, and my spouse is my two. Now, if you're here today and hoping to be married one day, and I'm thrilled that Shift is in with us, as well, our grade 7s to 9s, is that you could maybe word this idea like this, is that God is my one, and I hope to meet my two. So we unpicked the Sleeping Beauty, Prince Charming myth, that if you find the one, suddenly all of life makes sense, is God was only ever designed to be our one. Jesus put it like this in Matthew chapter 22 and verse 37. He said, Jesus replied, he'd just been asked, what is the greatest commandment? And Jesus replied, Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. Make him the one. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second, he said, is like it is love your neighbor as yourself. So it's not lack of priority for other human beings. It's not a lack of priority for my spouse. In fact, the very best gift I can give my wife is to put God at number one. And the very best gift she can give me is to do the same. As soon as another human being, or dare I say, as soon as the idea of another human being becoming the one picks that place, we're in trouble. That becomes an idol. I'll comment more on that in a minute. So if we could word the vow, and I've looked for different wording to try and make this work right across the spectrum this morning. If we could make a promise and make a vow of priority, maybe it would go something like this. Is that if you're married here this morning, that's where you are on the relational spectrum, is it would go something like this. I promise that God will be my first priority and my spouse will be my second. I promise that God will be my first priority and that my spouse will be my second. If you're hoping to be married, you might word this promise or this vow this way, is to say, I promise to seek the one while waiting for my two. I'm fairly sure some people who never plan, you're single and you never plan to marry again, for whatever reason. And you might like to just use the first part of that is, God, you are my number one priority. The white bits of that. I promise that God will be my first priority. I promise to seek the one. This is a very different idea to what Hollywood, to what Disney, and to what culture puts out. And yet, if you look at the results of the myth, the results of a wrong way of thinking around the idea of love and romance and sexuality, we end up with marriages, a divorce rate in the church that's not too different from a divorce rate outside of the church. And God is wanting to do something deep in our hearts, and this is the big idea this morning, is that He wants to be the number one. He wants to be, with the capital letter, the one. You see, anything other than God at number one, the Bible refers to as an idol. Now, in the times that the Bibles were written, in the time of the Old Testament, idols would be figurines cut in particular shapes, and people would look at those idols and say, well, that represents my God or my gods. Now, you might not cut idols like that in your household to look at, but anything that becomes number one in our life is an idol. And God says in the very first commandment in Exodus 20, verse 3, He says this, you shall have no other gods before me. I don't know if you've ever thought of the idea that another human being could be a God with a small g, could be the one. It's possible for the idea of love, romance, and a perfect marriage to be the idol. And God says, you shall have no other gods. No idea, no dream shall become before me. I want to be your very first priority. With God, let me rephrase it like this. God designed me, and He designed you with a place right at the apex of the triangle of priorities to have Him right at the top, right at the center, the most important one, the most important being Himself. I believe Ian a couple of weeks ago used the idea of a bicycle wheel. Did you have it up on stage, Geordie? I know you were planning on doing that. And on Friday, our family, we decided to be tourists in our own city, based on an idea that Phil had thrown out to me of what their family had done. So we went and hired 2 bikes, tandem bicycles, and one parent with one child each went on these bikes. This didn't happen on my bike, but on the other bike, they very nearly had quite a serious clatter down the stairs. Our bicycle had this front wheel that definitely hadn't been straightened for a very long time. And so our entire journey was with this wobbling front wheel. what happens is when it's not centered properly and those spokes aren't all tensioned to the right tension and it's out of alignment, you get a little wobble. If you were to use different length spokes, you would have a wheel that becomes oval and oblong, and a bicycle trip that would be impossible. And in a very small, poor analogy kind of way, God was designed to be the center of all the other spokes. He designed me to have Him at number one. I get to choose. I get to say, you know what, I have no need of God in my life or in my world or in my marriage or in my dating or in my singleness. I have no need of God at number one. And the wheel will become oblong. It will change its shape. And sometimes only over time do you look back and say, wow, the journey that I've had could have been different if God was right at the center, right at number one. It's not fair on another human being to make them number one. But if I'm married, they certainly should be number two. So I'd like to try and apply this in the time that we've got this morning in three different areas, and I don't even pretend that I'm going to do it perfectly. But I'd like to speak to single adults. I'd like to speak into the area of dating or being engaged, and then regarding marriage is what does it look like if God's number one? If I'm married, that my spouse is number two. When it came to single adults, I've had a number of really fascinating conversations with single adults in our local church. I'm not pretending to have all the answers on all the different problems and issues and ideas, but I did have this idea when we started this series is, why don't I get somebody to answer a couple of questions via video? And I thought of my younger sister. Her name is Ruth. She's 29 years old. She was a speaker here at our Flourish Women's Conference. Many of you the ladies that were here on Friday night would have heard her speak. And so she is the youngest of 5 children. Her 4 older siblings are all married with children, and she is not married. She's single. But she's got incredible, what's the right word? Passion and pursuit after God. And for me, strikes me as a person who most of the time lives with God right at the center, right as the one. So I phoned her up a little while ago and I said, would she be willing to come in and just do a video interview and answer 3 questions? So she did them, gave some of her thoughts. It's a 4-minute long clip. And then I'd like to get back up and share 1 or 2 other thoughts from the Bible in line with what she said. So please would you welcome to the video screen my younger sister, Ruth.
Yes, I do think that society places pressure on single adults to get into relationships. Sometimes people ask how I'm coping with this season of my life, which I always think is a funny question because I'm really quite enjoying myself. It can feel like society thinks that you're only successful if you're married and if you found your person, and if you haven't, there must be something wrong with you. Maybe you're too picky, or you're not open enough, etc. If we don't guard the way that we think, this way of thinking can leave people really discontent being single. I think single people fall into the trap of always thinking that the grass is greener on the other side, and that if only I found somebody, then I would be happy. But I love that verse in the Bible that says, godliness with contentment is great gain. I think that godly contentment is a real gift in every season of life, and being content with where God has you is what we should all aspire to. So I've dated 2 guys for a few months each, and I've always taken dating seriously. I wouldn't have got into the relationships if I didn't see the potential for those relationships to go the distance, but they didn't quite work out like that. And I must say, breaking up is not a favorite of mine. Both of these breakups happened on this one couch in my lounge, which we thereafter renamed the breakup couch. I never sit on it anymore. I think that the hard thing about relationships not working out is that all these thoughts start to go through your mind. Did I hear God wrong? What will people think of me? Is there something wrong with me? I've watched many people around me date and marry the first or second person that they dated, and so subconsciously I think I thought that it would be like that for me too, and then I had to face the feeling like a failure when those relationships ended. But in all honesty, in both those relationships, the day before we broke up, I literally prayed, Lord, if this guy is not in my future, please break this relationship off. And God took my prayer very literally. And so even though I can't always understand at the time, I can honestly say that I trust God wholeheartedly. He knows my future and He's never let me down. I remember a leader in the youth once teaching us that if you want to know what the focus of your life is, look at all that you spend your time thinking about, praying about, and speaking about. Sometimes I think for single people, marriage can become the focus of our thought life, our prayer life, and all that we speak about. And we think that God can only use us when we get married. But I really believe that God wants to use each of us in the place that we find ourselves in currently. He wants to be the focus of our prayer life, our thought life, and our speech. Practically, to make God a priority means to spend time with Him, reading the Word and prayer, not as an afterthought when we have spare time, but giving Him our very best time. I think it's also spending time with other people who put God first, which encourages us to do likewise, and also to get rid of distractions that try to take God's place as our top priority. In closing, I would like to share an excerpt that I read the other day that I think is very applicable as a single person. It says, patience is not merely the ability to wait, but also how we behave while we wait. We will all wait on many things in life, but to wait patiently is the goal that God had in mind for us. Waiting patiently is not possible unless we trust God's character is without flaw and that He is good and that He displays His goodness to us as long as we live. And so in whatever season we find ourselves in, we should aim to wait patiently to honor the Lord.
Is that coming through again? There we go. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, Paul writes, in the book of Corinthians, 1 and 2 Corinthians writes about relationships, about sexuality. But he writes about singleness with these verses, fascinating verses, verse 32 to 35. He says, I would like you to be free from concern. The writer who's writing this is Paul. He never married. He says an unmarried man is concerned about the Lord's affairs, how he can please the Lord. But a married man is concerned about the affairs of this world, how he can please his wife, and his interests are divided. An unmarried woman or virgin is concerned about the Lord's affairs. Her aim is to be devoted to the Lord in both body and spirit. But a married woman is concerned about the affairs of this world, how she can please her husband. I'm saying this for your own good, verse 35, not to restrict you, but that you may live in a right way in undivided devotion to the Lord. Now, I don't think Paul, in writing this, is against the idea of marriage. He's not writing it because he's cynical. In these verses, he is writing it because he recognizes he's acknowledging some of the energy that healthy marriages require to make it work. I think that these verses are much more a celebration of Paul's own vows of priority, his joy of deep, undivided devotion to the Lord. You see, what he says there is not automatic. It's not automatic that every unmarried man or unmarried woman automatically puts God first, but he is saying there's an opportunity to do it that is different, that's got slightly more energy behind it than somebody who has a number two. What's interesting to me is that Paul never apologized for not being married. He never used it as an excuse. He never backed down. This is a big deal for me, he never saw it as a limitation. He didn't sit around saying, until I find a two, I'm not going to do anything else. I'm just going to put things on pause. On the contrary, he went out and used his God-given gifts, his God-given talents, wrote a good chunk of the New Testament, planted churches. I mentioned just now, having been in Turkey, many of those churches were planted by Paul and his companions who traveled. I'd like to say this morning that if you are here and you are single, and if any married couple or married couples people that are happily married, have put any inadvertent pressure on you or made it seem like a limitation, is that's not the way the Bible sees it, and that's not the way God sees it. The writer of the large chunks of the New Testament words it completely the opposite way around. He said, I'd like you to be free from concern. I'd like you to live with undivided devotion to the Lord. And if He brings it to you, that's what you're trusting for and hoping for, fantastic, in His time. But that's no reason to put a life on pause or hold or anything that this myth puts on us, that until you find the one, now you can start really living. That simply isn't true. It's not in the Bible. Final comment before I move on to the next segment is, if you are here today, not married, not in a relationship, you are not defined by your number 2. You're defined, as we all are, by our relationship with God, who wants to be number 1. Alrighty, it's gone pretty quiet in here. I don't know if I'm the only one imagining that. I'd like to speak to those who are dating, or engaged to be married, or hope to be in a relationship in the next little while. And I'd like to ask you this question: what does it look like, or how would it adjust your relationships, your lens, your view of courtship, of marriage, if this was the primary question? Is God at number 1 in my world? Is He number 1? Surely it would pose this question, is that the person I'm looking to make a lifelong commitment to, this would be the follow-up question, is God at their number 1? Is God first in their priority? Because if not, that person could end up putting me at number 1. And while the idea sounds all nice and happy and romantic, it's definitely not good for me or for them to have a human being at number 1. So, if God is my 1, and I'm hoping to meet a 2, surely my lens that I'd walk around is looking for other people who love God, who are passionately committed, serving Him, following Him, have got some kind of Christ followership apart from just the Christian value system, of following Christ or engaging with Him. I heard a story of a girl who was raised in a church, and later on at the end of high school gets very uninvolved in church and disconnected and goes and does her own thing. And she goes off to university, and on her first trip back home, she says to her mom, "Mom, I've met this amazing guy, amazing Christian guy. He loves God so much. I think he might be the one. I think there might be some kind of future for us." And the mom says to her, "If he is the kind of guy you say he is, then I'm not sure he'll be looking for a girl like you right now, because God isn't at the center of your world." The Bible says very, very clearly in 2 Corinthians chapter 6 that as Christians, we shouldn't be in these kinds of close relationships with unbelievers. I've had so many interesting conversations with people around this idea. Because as soon as our emotions and our feelings get involved, there's a little part of our reason that struggles to find traction. And I don't think God ever says anything to try and ruin our fun or make our life worse. My picture of God is that He's an incredible Father. His word says in Isaiah that His ways are higher than mine and His thoughts are higher than mine. As a parent, I see that in my interaction with my kids. When they were very little, there were things that Jackson and I said to them, "Don't do that." Their thoughts at the moment were, "My mom and dad are being so cruel and unkind to me in this minute." But because our thoughts are a little bit different to theirs, we were able to, on some occasions, see things in the future that they couldn't yet see. So the eternal Father looks down on us as children, and He says, "Do not be unequally yoked with unbelievers." Speaking about getting into those kinds of relationships, Paul speaks at a different point. If you're already married to somebody, different verses in 1 Corinthians 7 about those. But here's the reason why I think our loving Father says this into the context of relationships. Is not because he wants to ruin fun, or because he wants to harm anybody. Quite the contrary. He knows that I was designed to have him as one and any other person that I meet and get married to as a two. If somebody is not a Christ follower, it is impossible by definition for them to have that outlook on life and the world. God is not their number one, not right at the moment. So I've heard some guys and girls saying to me, well, I'm going to start dating this person, or I'm currently dating this person in the hope that they will become a Christ follower. By God's incredible grace, some people have ended up becoming Christ followers through dating a Christian. And I say it's by incredible grace because, to my mind, that's in spite of rather than because of. In spite of that person's disobedience to God's injunction in 2 Corinthians, in spite of that, God is still eager to rescue people. God is so eager to get involved in people's lives. My suggestion, and what I think God is trying to say to us through His Word, is to give it a little bit of space to allow Him to do His work so that He can become number one in that person's life, and that the relationship starts off on a value system that is a little closer together than somebody who loves Jesus and somebody who definitely doesn't. Does that make sense? If this was a much smaller group, I'd almost feel like saying any questions. But I don't think I could cope with everybody asking a question right now. And our third block, to people that are married. What does it look like to have God as your number one priority and your spouse as your number two priority? Well, there are a couple of things in that. First of all, it involves God at one and our spouses, if you're married, at two. We spoke just now about not getting that mixed up. That person was never designed to be the one. But it's also, second comment to make, is that that person should never slip away from being the two. If God is my number one priority, then that person that I vowed to on the day of my wedding, made these vows, there's a priority that I need to carry before God to keep them as my two, that they know they're high in my priority. I'm going to give Jax, if she wants to, I said to her last night, if she wants to come up and say something near the end of this message, she's welcome. She might choose not to. It will be off-the-cuff comments. So I'd like to speak to just the men, if that's okay. And Jax, if you'd like to say something, great. If not, there's no pressure. But I'd like to speak to every man here today. God has designed us to have Him as number one in our life. Now, that might look a little different for different guys, okay? So ladies, please don't, don't put any pressure on the guy you married to that his life would look like somebody else's life, okay? That's not all that helpful. However, guys, when God is at number one, there are some things in our world that should show that. I think that if we're married and God's at one, we should, in our relationship, have the local church as a high priority. That we're a family. If you've got kids, that we're a family who worships God together. Our kids are pretty bright, all of them. Now, our kids can very easily work out what the priority system is like in our family and in the life of dad or husband, father. And when child grows up noticing all these other things are ahead of God, although my dad says God's a high priority, anything else that comes up is a higher priority, I'm not doing my kids a huge service by showing them that. Now, having said all of that, disinhakis, the grace bit, God's not sitting in heaven with a star chart marking my church attendance. He's doing something far more difficult than that. He's looking at my heart. Is this son of mine, whatever your name is this a young man, an older man who loves God and has God as the one? And men that have God as the one, it starts to show in other areas of our lives. It starts to show in our giving, in our involvement, in our connection, our willingness to serve. Again, no one life looks like anybody else. But if you are a Christ follower, guys, you're in any kind of relationship, we put God first we do what he says, it sends an invisible, what's the word, like this nuclear explosion. The waves ripple out from our lives into any other life around us. Small example, the Bible says, repent, which means come and become a Christ follower, and then get baptized. And if on that small thing, I say, well, yeah, I'm willing to do the first part, become a Christ follower. But anything else God says to me is a bit like a buffet. I'll just pick and choose the stuff I like, have a little bit of that. But I'm certainly not in this wholeheartedly. That sends out a strong message that he is not the one. Then when it comes to my spouse, again, speaking to men, because I'm not a woman, every now and then, I might make a comment. But one of the greatest gifts that I can give my spouse, and in our case, our kids, is that our boys know that mom is the number 2. God 1, mom 2. It's something we talk about, we joke about in our family in different ways. But hopefully our boys know that my relationship with their mom, my relationship with Jax, and her relationship with me is a higher priority than our relationship with them. You say to me, Steve, that sounds a bit like child neglect. Now, surely your kids need to know that they're loved. You need to make them feel secure. Oh, I hope that it does. Because I think that one of the greatest gifts that I can give them is letting them know that their mom is really important to me, that when they grow up, and hopefully, possibly, maybe one day, they find a 2, that they can go into their family knowing that that lady needs to be the 2. And it's incredibly complex and difficult. That's why I said relationships are messy and relationships are awkward. But somehow when kids come into the equation, the amount of time and effort required to raise children, the amount of involvement, all that kind of stuff, it's very easy for all of that to get a little bit muddied. And if we are not, Jackson and I, on keeping that relationship, just keeping finger on the pulse, solving the conflicts, figuring things out, committed to moving forward, it's very easy that the children can become a higher priority, if not at word, then at least in deed. This is what the Bible says, speaking to the guys. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 25 and verse 28. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church. Goes on to say in the same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. I don't know about you guys, but when I read the first part of that verse, there's a little bit inside of me that just gets absolutely cold sober. Put my name in there. Steve, you love your wife just as Christ loved the church. At about 1,000 points out of 100, I realize at how far short I fall on obeying that. I mean, you think of the love Christ has for the church, the incredible grace, the forgiveness, the kindness, the patience, all of that he gives to us. And look at my puny little efforts in our marriage, and I say, boy, I fall so far short. So God puts this impossibly high bar there, but that's not because he wants us to run away, it's because that's keeping to look at our example. How Christ loves us is how we were meant to love our spouses. So I think we could make some comments. First of all, I'd like to say this off this verse, is there's no such thing as a perfect marriage. Every single marriage, certainly that I'm aware of, is that we are works in progress. And it stands to good reason that there's no perfect marriage, is because it's got you in it if you're married. We are flawed human beings. And we bring selfishness as husband and wife into our marriage. We are intrinsically selfish. And marriage, as I heard somebody say the other day, marriage is one of the best institutions designed by God to beat selfishness out of us. Happiness, hopefully, is part of healthy marriages. But there is going to be some trauma as well as our selfishness slowly evaporates and disappears. But, so having said all of that, I would like to suggest, as we did in our marriage course last year that we ran, is that we believe that any couple where both spouses have God as their one and are committed to learning and growing in God and in their relationship can have a fulfilling marriage. Can I say that again? So now I'm stating an ideal here, but without this ideal, all other kinds of myths can creep in. Any couple where the husband and the wife have both got God as their one, and each person is committed to learning and growing in their relationship with God and each other, can have a happy and fulfilling marriage. This is, as far as I understand, the incredible basis, the basis of our faith, these incredible truths of forgiveness and love and etc. It's not that if things are going poorly, I haven't found the one. That's not as I understand. The Bible doesn't talk about that. It doesn't talk about this idea of a soulmate, the perfect match. But if a flawed human being, this is the person I marry, we've got God as our one and are committed to learning and growing, we can have a happy and fulfilling marriage. Most marriage problems, let me just speak for myself, that I've had and that I've observed as I've interacted with many people, I would go so far as to say every problem in marriage comes about when either God is not number one or one person is less committed to growing and moving forward than another person. Sometimes it might require even outside help to figure out how we move and grow forward, that we reach an impasse. But generally, if I'm going to put it in a simplistic way, it can be boiled back down to this. Is that either God's not number one, because if He's number one of my life, He's going to be saying stuff to me. Steve, you better change your behavior or your attitude. And saying the same to Jax. You stop being committed to growing and learning, and you keep moving forward, my boy. But God, you've got no idea who I'm married to. I've got a better idea than you. She's my daughter. You need to fix things. You need to go and change. Go and say sorry. And vice versa. Can you see, we're talking an ideal, but hopefully we all want to grow in some way, somehow, into that. By God's grace, knowing I can't force somebody else to do it. Every marriage has a slightly unique rhythm, slightly unique thumbprint. We're all different people involved. I would like to say this, and then I'm going to give Jax an opportunity. I presume you're carrying a microphone, so you've got stuff to say. Is every major change in our lives brings unique pressure and unique opportunity to learn and grow. I realized this when we moved here 6 years ago. It was a new everything except country for us in moving down here. And after a few months of processing new leadership role, new everything, new schools, house, felt like the whole world had been turned upside down. I remember Jack saying to me, it was very difficult conversations, saying to me, she says, I feel like I've lost you. And I was so Christ-like, so gracious, I immediately responded, I'm so sorry, honey. How can I change? No, it was far from that. I was defensive. Like, what do you mean? We're doing good. I'm pulling a lot of conversation down into just a few. We're trying to follow God's will. Surely you can see how absolutely swamped, my brain feels like I can't even sleep at night. I've got so much stuff going through my brain. And in her gracious way, she just at a different time reiterated, I feel like I've lost you. Not lost, but we're not connecting in the same way. And that stood to reason because so much had changed. We needed to find a new normal, a new rhythm. It was different. Every new child, every move, any job change, any season of life change involves a change in one or both of us, and we've got to find a new normal, a new rhythm, a new place. That's not to say everything that went before wasn't working. It's I've got to find a new normal of how to move forward from here, knowing all these extra pressures. My amazing, gracious, darling wife, please come and correct everything I've said that was wrong.
Hello, everyone. So I think I just have 2 comments. I might have more later this afternoon when I get more time to think about it, and then I'll go, oh, wish I'd said that. But off the cuff, that word priority and being number 2, I think I'd just like to comment on that. And I'm very comfortably number 2. I'm really grateful because I agree wholeheartedly with Steve that being number 1 is impossible for any one of us to fulfill and to be in someone else's life. But being number 2 and how to keep each other as a priority, because we're all so different, I think that there are different ways that I feel like I'm a priority to Steve and that he feels like he's a priority to me. And I think the best gift we can give each other is to ask ourselves the question, how can I make him feel like a priority in my life? How can I make him feel like he's number 2? And vice versa, if he asks that question and we spend our time asking that question of ourselves, we'll have a very fulfilling and happy marriage, because often I can answer how he can make me feel more like a priority, but I'm not always as good at answering how I can make him feel like a priority. I'm not a very spontaneous person. I like to plan. I sometimes plan spontaneity, but off-the-cuff ideas don't generally work very well at making me feel like a priority. But in seasons of busyness, if I know we have planned time together, or I know Steve's planned to do something with me, that often helps tide me over in moments when I'm not physically or practically a priority. I know I'm going to be a priority. Does that make sense? So those are our little, it's one of the things we've spoken about often, and it's really helped me in terms of the busyness of everyday life. I know I can look forward to that moment when I will be the priority and I will be a good number 2. And then I just wanted to share this verse because it's been very meaningful to me along this whole journey, and it's Psalm 16 verse 8. It says, I have set the Lord always before me. Because he is at my right hand, I shall not be shaken. I have set the Lord always before me. And that's a picture, I think, of this priority number 1, is it doesn't just happen by accident. It doesn't naturally happen. It's very easy to get caught up in putting my expectations on Steve or on a friendship or on something other than God. And I have to work out in my heart and my mind, have I set the Lord before me? Have I set God ahead of me? And if I do that, my priorities will be in the right place. And sometimes I think, particularly in marriage, we can put our expectations wrongfully on our spouse to fulfill the desires and the needs that actually God can only fulfill. And when I don't set the Lord before me, I often can be more irritated, more short, and more tricky to deal with as a spouse, because I've put my expectations in the wrong place. And I know it's important to communicate, these are the things that make me feel like a priority, and these are the things you can do to help me feel like a good number 2. But we need to make sure that we've set the Lord before us first, and that our first priority is him, and that our expectations are on him to make us whole, to heal us, to comfort us, and to provide us with a fulfilling life. And then we can go to our spouse with the other priorities, priority number 2. That's it.
Thanks so much, Jax. Could I ask you to stand together with me, please?